Marigold, thank you so much for talking with me today and giving us the opportunity to know more about your work. I'm sure, I don't know if I've told you this, but when I was researching for this show, like a year and a half ago, you were one of the first artists that came to mind. And, I've been following your work for some time. So, and we are really fortunate to have, these two works in the show that you produced specifically for relations. And it's like, you're a very busy artist, and that you decided to make something completely new. It meant a lot, to me and to the show. So thanks a lot.
Well, I just want to extend a thank you to you as well, Cheryl, for thinking of me when you were conceptualizing this exhibition. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of it. I'm really honored, especially when you told me about all the other artists that were going to be in the show and what the show was about. I just was so, my heart just swelled up. So thank you to you as well.
Right. Wow. I have a lot of questions because I know that these two works represent a kind of, not exactly a new direction, but an amalgamation of sorts. And, but, if we could start, there's some blanks actually in my understanding of how you came to become an artist. So, and the fact that you work in such a wide variety of media and forms, from painting, but then also installation and sculpture, and, way back in the day, performance as well. And now your practice is like kind of blossomed into including ceramics and tattooing, right? It's like pretty prolific person, as well as multi-talented. And the many themes you explore, include like hybridity and this idea of protection, and you use myth and folklore. You look at narratives of resilience and an examination of the construction of self, which we'll definitely talk about with these works in the show. And you're really forthright in your artist statement about the fact that your diasporic consciousness is a vital force that empowers and informs your work. So maybe we can start, from earlier days, when you started to make images. Would that have been when you were still in the Philippines?
That's a really good question, because I would say that, yeah, I was born in the Philippines, and that's probably when I did start making images for the first time ever. And I think it might have been by accident, I want to say, just like maybe the inception of me mark making. And it's really funny because I have this piece of evidence right here. I'm going to show it to you really quickly. I just only know because it's just right here. And it's like I carry it around in my laptop case. So here it is, my laptop case. But I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, wow, yes.
So it says easy art lessons, and then there's a little round-faced me.
Oh,
and this happened at the Philippine Heart Center, which is actually where my mom worked. So I think that maybe as a form of babysitting, she threw me into these art lessons. And then perhaps maybe that's where they were like, oh, she's got some sort of skills in this. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps I also decided that was something interesting for me. But I didn't actually really, I don't think I took it seriously. When we moved to Canada in the late 80s, from the Philippines, I was just, a little kid. I was 7 years old. I don't think I was really thinking much about art in school. I was really concentrating on learning how to speak English. Mm-hmm. and to sort of be a part of the social landscape around me as a kid that didn't know how to speak this language, and that had just moved from a tropical country to this other country that we glorified out east, and we really looked towards the West. And so Um, but I think that like when making these images that are particular to exploring my diaspora, that really started when I went into art school. And, art school is a place where you can experiment and you're sort of learning about yourself and you're learning about art and all sorts of things. And yeah, my art school experience, I just really wanted to focus on things that I wanted to sort of unearth a little bit more about. And I couldn't help but just start thinking about, where I came from. And at this point, like when my family first immigrated to Canada, we lived in Scarborough, which I was so grateful for too, like looking back, because it was such a diverse community that we were just like, plopped in. And yeah, I just got to like understand sort of the diversity that can be in this country. But it also taught me a lot about racism, like very early on. But yeah, so when I was in art school and I was looking at, my family's particular history of coming to Canada as immigrants, I was really thinking about, the loss of language, since I, gave up my mother tongue, which is Tagalog, which is something that I still can understand fluently, but I'm not proficient in verbalizing it, which is a really weird thing. I was wondering about that. And I really think that that was possibly what spearheaded my investigation. Because as you know, my work really, it explores the narratives of folklore in the Philippines. And that's sort of what I was thinking about as an immigrant. What do you bring with you? What can you bring with you? And then what do you leave behind? And so as a kid, what could I bring with me except for just the things that I was told? And that really played a big part, which was this narrative. But then as an adult, thinking back to the fact that I don't even speak that language, and there's a strange disconnect between the fact that I can understand a language but not speak it. Like it comes in through my head and then it comes out in English. So I think really that's maybe the genesis of like that image making. And then from there, from my undergrad onwards into my master's and then onto present day, it's been constantly mining and looking back and like deepening the explorations that maybe started then.
Mm-hmm. What part of the Philippines does your family hail from?
Manila,
Okay.
the Luzon. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, my family's from Negros, so
Whoa.
Visayas. But
Yeah.
yeah, I've been to Manila a few times, and have you been back? Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
do that regularly, or sort of from time to time when?
I wish it was more regular. The last time I was there was probably 5 years ago, I would say. Yeah.
Right.
And so it's already been some time. And I was planning on going there again this year, since I was going to be in Japan at some point. But, it might be a while until that happens again. But obviously, I would love to go back.
Mm-hmm.
But since we moved to Canada, I feel like I've been back probably 5 or 6 times.
And did you have that phenomenon of that kind of remove again, sort of being even further articulated as a balikbayan,
Mm-hmm.
going back, and it's like, oh, how Filipino am I still, coming back to the Philippines after being,
Mm-hmm.
um, after the attempts at assimilation into Canadian, sort of
Mm-hmm.
dominant culture. Did you have that experience going
Oh,
back?
yeah. And it's so interesting because that word balikbayan is something that I just, I feel so deeply, connected to in a strange
Yeah.
way, because it doesn't, for those who don't know what that means, I mean, maybe the translation would be to a person who returns or a person who comes back home, I
Mhm.
guess, in essence. And it's really used as a term for a person who has lived abroad or has gone abroad and has come back, is my understanding of it.
Mhm.
And so whenever I would go back, and it was increments of like my age, but I feel like I went the most in high school onwards, high school and post high school. So I was old enough to kind of understand what was going on. And definitely there was a feeling of really like really attached to this landscape, attached to the culture, but not really knowing that I grew up elsewhere, and knowing that I was being understood as that, like that was being projected on me, and that was what I was going to be wearing while I was there. And it was like, oh, look at how you speak English so perfectly, and and look at how you dress, and and they would, and the communities that I would be around, like, so it would be like my family members, or like extended family members, and strangers as well. It was more the strangers that would come up to me and just like investigate me and speak about me in Tagalog, and I knew exactly what they were saying, but then I just couldn't say anything back, and in Tagalog as well, and I would just be like, how do I say, I can understand you and I can understand all of these things, but then if I said it in English, actually they, sometimes they would know and other times they wouldn't. So it was this interesting thing where you feel like you belong there because you do, because that's where I was born, and I remember all of these places, and this is my like old house and where my family still live, but then you feel also very disconnected. So yeah, and then you come to Canada, and then that's also on the flip side of it.
Right, right. I mean, what you're speaking to is really interesting in terms of the plurality of vision. It's a plurality of cognition as well. And the frustration lies in it not being able to extend to, the plurality of like the tongue, and being able to, thoroughly recover any kind of sense through language. And I mean, I totally share that frustration, or, the questions, that I receive, all the time, like, do you speak your parents' languages? And it's like, well, no, and having to explain why, and then the kind of the shame that comes,
Shame, right? Yeah, there is. And I've recently been, language has really been top of mind for me. I feel like when we think about like, cultural histories, we really think about languages. And, now I think in my practice and sort of with all of my explorations, I'm really coming back to that again. The thinking of what am I doing as a part, what am I doing in terms of this longing for this language, and how my work is really all encompassing, thinking about identity, thinking about multiplicity, thinking about empowerment, and thinking about selfhoods, and understanding the histories in my culture, in your culture, and just trying to understand, like, how then do I become a responsible person going forward? How do I, in essence, like, understand what I'm researching, what I'm studying, what I'm reconceptualizing, and then how do I then move forward as a responsible individual, as an artist, as an image maker, as a person who has thoughts that then I present. And so language is something that's really been top of mind for me, because I've been so I guess I really want to just take language classes again, and I really want to learn Tagalog in a more in-depth way. And over the years, I always ask my parents to speak to me in Tagalog still, but it's fascinating too how they will just stick to speaking in English to me. And, I can't fault them for that. It's easier for them, and it's really fascinating what happens. And I think even that's what happened in the beginning, is that like they probably just stopped speaking in Tagalog a lot and just pushed that English on us as kids.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame my parents for how they decided to deal with language. And I think they thought that they were doing the best thing that they could, in order to ensure our success and survival here. There's a lot of concerns, right, wrapped up in that, and ultimately the intentions are good. But definitely the way that you're working with images and the image making that you are engaged with is a language, and it's also the responsibility that you speak of comes with a lot of power, and you're using that power, that you have to make these kind of suppressed narratives, and like these things that are there, like in between, meaning, really meaningful for us, for those of us who um, pick up on these references that are also still quite subtle. There's no hitting us over the head, with any of the deeper meanings, which is also what makes your painting so fascinating, your work so fascinating. So my question then becomes about medium, because I'm curious to know what it is about painting for you, or preference for certain materials, or when you decide to, I mean, maybe later I'll ask you more about why, you slid into, ceramics and tattooing more recently, but what is it about painting?
It's so interesting. And in answering this question, I'm going to reveal a secret. And it's not a secret for a lot of people, but the interesting thing about painting is that I actually, in art school, I didn't take any painting courses. So I actually am not trained in painting at all. But I guess I started painting because I was really into drawing. And drawing is really like maybe I guess if I really had to describe what my practice is really about, I would say drawing is my most immediate, most direct way of speaking about an image or translating it into form. And I mean, I've said that before, but even like my sculptures are drawing, and even the music I've made in some ways is drawing, because I approach it in that same way. And printmaking, which is something I did a lot when I was in school, is just another version of drawing. You're just drawing with different, materials, a different process. And so when I was, I don't think I really painted until I was at the end of my master's, to be honest with you. And what happened was, in my master's degree, which I took at Concordia University, I was making really big drawings. I got into that program in print media. I didn't make any prints. Everybody was like, what are you doing? I was like, I don't want to make prints. So I was doing everything else but making prints. And then I was making these really big drawings, and I would find the biggest pieces of paper I could find, and they would eventually get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when it came down to doing my thesis work, I couldn't find a piece of paper that was big enough. And so moving into painting was more a practical thing, because I could find canvas that was big enough. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess that's going to be the support I use. And, thinking back to it, of course, I didn't have to go that conventional route. I could have gone right on the wall. I could have done other things, but that's what I did. And then I had to teach myself how to paint from there. And it was like, okay. And I think that is really kind of the driving force, is that I feel like I need to do something, and I just will, take it in my own hands to figure out how to do something. And then I will. And so I feel like with painting, it's not like I invent it. I go and do the research, and I ask, trusted friends who are willing to knowledge share and be like, hey, painting major person, tell me, what is gesso? Things like that. And I think because I didn't have any formal training in that, and I didn't have to be weighed down by like the formal qualities that were expected, just on a technical note, I really did like figure that out on my own, and like make a lot of mistakes. And even to this day, I've taught painting in university courses before, and I have done the research by now, and I know like, okay, well, this is how you mix paints, and that way. But I always make sure to tell my students that like, you don't have to do it like that. Like you can subvert that in your own way as well, because that's what I did.
Yeah, that's a really good message, for young artists to hear. You can learn, you can know how things are done, and then maybe there's a way that means something to you to do it a different way. Or
Yeah,
yeah, and subvert is the right word, right? To like disrupt, conventional ways and practices.
for sure. Especially like I think in art school, and also just, in art making in general, there's just really no sense in always continuing the same ways of doing something. I mean, that's how you experiment and create and find new directions. So, I mean, why not? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a time-honored tradition, right? Like to totally like bust through what's already being
That's
done.
true. I know.
I'm curious to know why bigger. Why did you need to go bigger?
Yeah,
With
I just felt that, the images that I was making at the time and even to this day were starting to explode in terms of size and scale inside the boundaries of the work itself. So I was starting to create worlds. And in those worlds, I found that the more detail I could imbue in it, the more atmospheric and qualities that I could create, this like otherworldliness, the more convincing or transportative it was, and just how effective it was in drawing a person's curiosity to come closer and then also to step back and sort of take it in. So it was a consideration for that. Like the scale itself was a way to create atmosphere and to create a world in which a viewer could go into.
Right. Yeah, they are rather immersive, these very large drawings that you make, and you can get lost in them, which is great. I mean, it definitely allows us to kind of have almost a one-to-one, like a relationship with the works and that kind of direct experience. So let's talk about the worlds.
Yeah.
And let's unpack some of those elements of your cosmology and how you identify with them. Maybe we could start with a really early work, Modern Aswang from 2009, and
Yes.
how that work kind of developed from there, into later bodies of work. Yeah, tell me what about that work.
Yeah, the modern Aswang series, there are you referring to the ones in that were like on the Japanese paper that are the crystallized figures and those ones? Yeah, because that was the series. So those pieces were coming from my, again, reconceptualization of this folkloric character in Philippine mythology called an aswang. And I guess I'll just speak a little bit about that to fill in some of the
Yeah.
listeners about that particular folklore. So, yeah, in my master's, again, thinking about multiplicity of self and fragmentation, and also the narrative of folklore that I was bringing with me and investigating again, I immediately remembered, and maybe I didn't even remember, it was always with me, this character called an aswang. And aswang is spelled Asuang or Aswang. And that's kind of important for me to bring up because the way that the aswang is understood in the Philippines is understood in multiple ways. So there isn't one singular definitive way to understand an aswang. And the aswang mythology also changes depending on the region and who's telling the story, and also evolves over time, because an aswang has there's various types of aswang, and the one that I'm the most obsessed with is the one that's called the manananggal, which it translates to separate. To separate. And it is one that this kind of figure that looks like a person by day, at night, severs in half, severs from their waist up, and this aswang will then discard its lower half, and then its upper half will fly in the night. And it's a really violent and scary creature that then feeds on babies, and it's got like this long proboscis that can eat. And there's so many different stories, different ways it's being told. But it's a very scary creature that then at the end of the night really has to come back and rejoin its lower half. Otherwise it will die fragmented. And so in just alone, like that idea of this particular aswang really brought me back to the things that I was thinking about as a person in diaspora, as a person who feels fragmented, who feels multiple, who feels fractioned in many ways, and that, you know, detaching and attaching is a form of survival. And that's really, you know, a way that we think about it through that lens as well. And so I kept thinking, well, you know, I would research a little bit more about also, I can talk about the history of the aswang and where that comes from, but just to get back to your question, I would play around with some of the stories about the aswang, like, well, okay, well, what if this aswang like separated from its lower half, but then it came back at the end of the day, and then it joined some other aswang's lower half. And then I was like, well, can you mix and match your bottoms? And like things where I would just kind of play with this idea. And then I thought, well, what if you separated and joined again, but you joined with not your bottom half, but with like an object or a landscape? What would that mean then? How would you hybrid that way? And what would that result in? And so that's where modern aswang comes from, because those particular aswang don't at all look like the way that aswang is presented in the Philippines. It's not a person with long black hair, though sometimes they do present it that way. It's not a person with long black hair that's just cut in half, that's like got wings, or, you know, it's a monster that looks to have then joined with different elements like landscape, like mountains, like you know, plant life, like objects, and that other parts of this monster's body is severing. So it's not just the waist that severs, it's like maybe it's its hand, or maybe it's its foot, maybe it has multiple eyes. And that again speaks to the folklore, but it then just sort of reconceptualizes it so that it's not just about a creature that talks about conditioning us to be afraid at night and to like serve as a boogeyman. This now becomes something else, and it talks about identity and self through these multiple things. You know, how can you then create these divides or severances as something that's positive and empowering, rather than something that's evil and breaking you down?
The aswang is often a female form, yes?
Yeah.
And from my understanding too, through your work, has been that sort of before Spanish colonization, the aswang could also be, or was also known as a kind of medicine woman or a healer, and that this perception had been co-opted and changed and as a way of well, it's a colonialist technique or tool, right, to get people to I guess espouse, you know, the values of the colonizing country. So, you know, to move towards Catholicism and to like kind of leave your mythologies behind because they're kind of evil and more kind of used to scare people and get kids to behave and stuff like that. And I feel like you've reclaimed, you know, the aswang in so many ways, you know, and in addition, making us sort of getting us to think about the patriarchal hold, you know, that that Spanish colonization had on the Philippines, you know, to kind of vilify the female form. Mm-hmm. And so I really love how you know, you reappropriate that whole thing and you turn it around, but also in recognition of the fact that, yeah, the myths are alive. Yeah, they evolve and they are going to be told differently by different people in different regions. And but in its translation to the Canadian context, I think that's, you know, kind of really vital, you know, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And then you brought the aswang. I mean, this is I don't know what, over a decade, right? That you've been working with the aswang. Mm-hmm. the
Yeah.
Aswang form, and then sort of developing it further into the exhibition that Zoe Chan curated, Personal Mythologies, and then the Coven Ring
Mm.
exhibition, the solo exhibition that you had at Articule in 2013, which again, like the Aswang kind of, you brought the Aswang into a relationship with what would become it or evolve to the question of the woven, the woven strips of material, because there was a really big drawing in Coven Ring that sort of had this sort of a swung, was sort of really powerful,
Yeah.
boxing swung.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, Coven Ring is an exhibition. So that I did an article and I've done it a couple times, or it's exhibited a couple times. But at the time that I was working on Coven Ring, I was researching just witchcraft, just the idea of witchcraft, because the Aswang is understood to be sort of a version of a hybrid of a witch and a vampire.
Yeah.
And, that was brought in, obviously, even though there's many versions of like vampiric creatures or witchy creatures cross-culturally, obviously, like this, the Spanish had colonized the Philippines, and the Aswang was born out of this colonial violence. And I can talk a little bit about that later, sort of the research behind that I had found. But at the time that I was just like, I just want to know a little bit more about witchcraft and sort of how we understand it in
Mm-hmm.
like European context or North American context. But at the same time, I had taken up recreational boxing, and I was really interested in boxing for myself as a part of my self-care regimen as an artist. And, naturally as artists or thinkers, we often see parallels in what we're doing, and that's, we're kind of critical about everything that we're doing in our life, whether it's cooking or just your daily day stuff. And so I would, and through this research, I was reading this book or it's like a long essay that Joyce Carol Oates had written called On Boxing. And everyone knows Joyce Carol Oates for, fiction writing, and, she's an incredible writer, but not a lot of people know that she's actually a boxing aficionado, and that when she was a kid, her father would bring her to these boxing matches, and she just knows so much about boxing and the history of boxing. So she wrote this incredible essay that I was really taken by, and she really talks about how boxing happens in this magical ring between two people that are your mirror other. So that's sort of like what I really attach to this idea of like your mirror self, and that your opponent is essentially yourself that you are fighting or you're in a bout with. And it's this thing that happens in this magical space. There's an understanding within this magical space. No one is allowed to enter it. And there is this, understanding. There's a series of, ritualistic things that happen in boxing, even from what you wear to who's around you, and all the terminology, and like the body bags as surrogates for the body and all these things. I was just like, I love it. And then I just started making this work. But yeah, and as you mentioned, to go back to what you said, in Coven Ring, there's a massive painting, and it might be the biggest one I've done. I think it was like 15 feet by 9 feet, or like, no, maybe even 10. Yeah. And it was called Encounter, and it shows like these two Aswang that are sort of frozen in time, that are either about to fight or the fight has already happened. And the reason why you think that is because they are enshrouded in various protective gear that may or may not work. So the protective gear looks like it's either, braided or knit together, woven. It looks like maybe it's made out of wood that doesn't look like it's very strong, plasterized, injuries. And it's this play on this idea of protection and empowerment. And so the Aswang in this situation takes a little bit of a dive into, that research of mine, and start to portray it through their language of gesture and sport and ritual. So yeah, that's an interesting exhibition for me.
I was reading in Marissa's essay that'll be in the publication about more about protection and its origins for you, and its link with arriving in Canada from the Philippines and being given, you know, blankets and really thick sweaters, and then it made me think about how, you know, these strips of material being kind of wrapped and woven, you know, and like really getting into, even as a small child, maybe like pulling a blanket or a sweater over one's head, and then being really conscious of all the yarn, you know, the matrix of that yarn, which becomes really your barrier of protection between, you know, the outside world and the world that you had become connected or comfortable with, you know, at home with, and it's sort of being uh, like a totally new negotiation. Um, so maybe you could talk about like that protection, as well as the connection with healing, that comes with a little bit of that image, and a lot of the imagery as well, that I've seen throughout the years, and that we see in the two works in the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that idea of the woven, because the woven is a thing that occurs in my work all the time, and it really is part of the aswang sort of visual language that I make. And you know, I've spoken about it before, but the woven really represents this idea of fragmentation and detachment and reattachment. So anything that is woven or braided that has the ability to unravel has the exact same ability to come back together. And then that form of coming back together can have multiple ways of being put back together, and maybe can be reinforced and repaired in a way that's even stronger and more resilient than the first. And, you know, again, that really refers back to the whole aswang attachment. Like, what if you attach to something else, and then you empower yourself through the ways that you heal. And so the woven it started in my work because I was thinking about also, there are things about the aswang that just inherently are braided or woven, and in culture as well. So even, okay, the aswang, as you mentioned, sometimes is portrayed as a woman with like long black hair, and, you know, the hair can sometimes become weaponized, and it can, obviously, like sexuality can be weaponized. And so another thing about aswang is that as a method to ward them off, I read, like, you can wrap your thumbs. You can wrap your thumbs, and it's sort of like a talisman that can help you, protect you from being eaten by or attacked by an aswang. And so in the early forms of my woven images, you'll see braided hair, or you'll see wrapped fingers. And that actually comes from just like thinking about that stuff. But then over time, through research and through dialogue and just through growth, you start to evolve that idea. And then you start to remember, like, so in Coven Ring, all of a sudden, I'm so used to wrapping my arms, because when I, you know, put my gloves on, my boxing gloves, I have to wear wraps. And then I'm reminded about this, like, wrapping of fingers as protection, right? And then that then evolves into other things. And it makes you just think visually of pattern and thinking of like woven and braided. And you brought up the sweaters that I've talked to Marissa about. You know, when you move to Canada from a place like the Philippines, you know, you don't own sweaters really. Like, you don't own thicker layered clothing that's meant to keep you warm. In fact, you wear the opposite to try to keep you cool. And in Canada, all of a sudden you're layered and you're bundled. And I remember just being a kid, like, my mom would make me wear this awful purple coat, which I actually think now is pretty cool. But like back then I was like, ugh. And so I would have to wear, you know, all of these layers, but it's a form of protection, and maybe it's magical protection, because you have to believe in these things before, you know, and so, you know, from there, from the woven elements that can, you know, be in the way that I create these shrouds on these aswang that I make. And so then the shrouds started to become braided, or the aswang started to like look like they were wearing these braided or woven shrouds essentially, and they would cover the figure as a form of protection. And then that then evolved into shrouds that weren't braided or woven anymore, but just there were shrouds that looked like they were layers of transparency and layers of ink, and playing with this idea of opacity and transparency that you could see through or not see through, and also that looked like it was maybe their skin and maybe not their skin. And the way that I did that was just, I started making these drawings where the marks on the shrouds were like these inky, amorphous, organic marks that would happen through ink, you know, just through that medium. And the fluidity of it would lend itself to making these marks that I just fell in love with. And then that just came to symbolize like the new version of protection as a way of also embodying your experience. So instead of like having this shroud that almost looks like you're hiding underneath it, the shroud then starts to become something that is transparent and is actually projecting your experience. And then so your empowerment comes in owning your experience. Your empowerment comes in like claiming what those individual lived experiences are that become markers on your body, markers on your personhood. And you can choose to reveal it, or you can choose to not reveal it. And that's sort of where the empowerment comes, is through choice. And so I guess maybe to circle back to what you're saying with the word healing, is that healing really comes, I think, through a sense of acceptance of where you are and what you have, and an understanding. And so that can really come when you can embrace it fully. And I feel like when you can embrace your experience, and then you can really heal that way.
I mean, it's such a potent image, and with all of that, you know, the depth of history, you know, behind it, and that it's a living thing. I think it's, you know, definitely could keep on working with the Aswang, you know, forever. I think it's just, yeah, I mean, I want you to anyway. How about the development of your interest in landscape and the exploration of plants and trees, and the sort of the creation of these worlds that are not actually inhabited in the frame by a humanoid figure?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because sometimes people look at my landscapes as like a departure from my figurative works, but I actually find them one and the same. And they feed off of each other, and they're part of the same series. And for me, landscape has always been present, even from in the beginning of the Aswang inception in my work, because I was thinking about these figures hybriding with the land, like hybriding with this Canadian landscape, right? So those early Aswangs looked like they were stuck to Rocky Mountains, and they were stuck to, you know, coniferous plant life that was really particular to North America. And so I was always looking at that, and you can't help but look at that, especially if you come from a different country that doesn't have snow and that doesn't have that particular you know, coldness, or, you know, landforms that come from that as a result. So I've always looked at landscape. And then now when you know, there was a certain time when I went to the desert, and I loved the desert, and I fell in love with the desert. And it was a place that was always like inside me, that I wanted, as a young adult, wanted to go visit. And then I did, and eventually realized that this felt like a very powerful and spiritual place for me. And when I was there, I was in a particular headspace, and I have been there multiple times, but the very first time, I saw these landscapes that were almost speaking to me in personified ways. You know, they were kind of like anthropomorphized, and they were enacting or gesturing in some ways the way that I was thinking. And at the time I was thinking, you know, I was maybe more in a darker emotional place. I'm always emotional, but like it was this like heavier space where I saw that the plant life was gesturing to that. And of course, that's us as humans. We love to project and we love to see things where things are not, or it really just calls to our imagination and our creativity. So I would see these plants as that, gesturing to that. But also, I would then, use plant life as well to talk about like a dismembered figure as well, like being severed from a whole, like, so there's a lot of like floral botanical things that happen in my work that talk about, again, that severing, that like attachment, detachment stuff. But basically, ultimately, the landscape is a place that holds the body, the absence of a body, but the body is there in the way that it describes itself. So the way that the landscape describes the gradient of the sky can be a way that we describe the gradient of our emotional landscape, which is nuanced and is on a spectrum. And that it talks about, like the land formations being a way in which we journey. And how we pilgrimage, or how we exist, and contemplating what we see, and also how we prioritize it. And so, yeah, like it's always been a really big part of that. And as of late, the landscapes that I make are really surreal. They're collaged memories, they're collaged experiences. They don't really make sense. There isn't like a accuracy to them, I guess. Like there's ways in which you can familiarize yourself with elements of those landscapes that I make. You go, oh yeah, that looks like that looks like a Joshua tree, or that looks like, the Badlands of Alberta. And you can recognize those things, but they actually come from an amalgamation of layered memories and layered experiences. So I'll mishmash these landscapes to hybrid with each other, and attach and detach amongst themselves. So they embody that Aswang mythology in them as well.
Totally. And then with the two works in the show, Shroud in Threadbare Light 1 and 2, we have these incredibly powerful woven aswangs with these like hats, these like woven hats that kind of obscure their whole heads. But again, against this landscape where you beautifully present plants, the ginger plant and the camelbush plant kind of like emerging, growing from, the certain parts of their bodies. And I felt like the sky that you speak of, I mean, you don't know whether it's day or night. It could be either, and I found that really fascinating in terms of the working and living within an in-between space where day can be night and night can be day. Like, why not? And this woven thing taken to another level, where it's like kind of referencing like Filipino craft, right? What brought you to this moment, where these kind of, where there's a lot of layering, actually, the aswang, but also as you're describing the aswang in relation as a landscape, it's kind of an incredible mise en abîme.
I feel that as well about those works. And, when you invited me to be part of the show, I was thinking of these ideas already. They were like brewing inside of me. And so when you had proposed the exhibition, I was like, I really want to use this opportunity to like talk about these things already that are, have, culminated. And so, those particular characters, Aswang and Threadbare Light 1 and 2, as you describe them, to have those really big hats that are like, they sort of reference a traditional hat in the Philippines called a salakot, which is like, it can take on different shapes, but they're, usually woven out of, grasses or bamboo, and they're, very strong hats that are used to protect a person from the sun or the rain or the wind. And so, as I talk about the shroud or the aswang and the shroud evolving through my work, whether it's like has become woven with yarns and knits and heavy things, all the way to, you know, woven things that are transparent. That's sort of another iteration of it, is that now I'm looking at actual materials that are really from the Philippines that I remember as part of my physical landscape. So not even just imagination landscape, but like physical landscape. So, you know, you're looking at this pattern of this woven grasses, which there's as you might know, like the banig, which is, you know, mats that are beautifully, you know, hand woven. They can be present in, like, you know, fans or bags and hats, and like these mats are always on the floor. You can roll them up, you take them out. And, you know, even in the most modern houses in the Philippines still contain these patterns and gestures of texture. So, you know, even like the parquet floor, I still, you know, in the Philippines, I still see that wovenness in the like desire to have a parquet floor, you know what I mean? So that then those creatures are made out of those woven things that I'm referencing. But furthermore, there's this like transparency through them, which calls onto this previous ink drawings of the transparent shrouds that I've made, and also really thinking about transparent materials that are particular to the Philippines, like the piña fabric, right? And so that piña fabric, for those who don't know, is the fabric that's used to make the traditional, one of the traditional formal wears that is worn in the Philippines, called oh my goodness, barong. I kept, because I have the word banig in my head. I'm like, what B word, barong. So yeah, so the barong is like this, you know, semi-transparent formal shirt that is woven. It's so incredible.
Yeah.
You know, painstaking, labor-intensive method of harvesting pineapple fibers. So then what comes out of it is this beautiful pineapple silk, you know, they call it that. And, you know, it comes from the leaves of the pineapple plant that has been, like, you know, removed and unearthed, this very thin hair, like, you know, as thin as hair, hand knotted and then woven. So it's just painstaking. And then you make these beautiful garments out of them. And so, yeah, all of that is just, you know, stuff that I know about, and maybe I'm just so fascinated by it too, because I had purchased a whole bunch of barong fabric that I wanted to use at my wedding, and fortunately I didn't use it at my wedding, and I now will use it for my artwork. And so
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah. The barong, you know, is really fascinating to me. It's a really interesting garment, and, you know, to use it, you know, as a way to think about transparency and opacity, sort of strength, and I guess a kind of fragility or fineness is, you know, really fascinating. The other thing about these shrouds, and Marissa writes this in her text, that, quote, while her feet appear firmly planted in place, she is at risk of coming undone at any moment, end quote. So, you know, it's like I see her kind of taking up on this sort of boxing stance, if you will, but then, you know, that the wovenness does have this transparency, that you identify the form through what is being woven around to delineate the limbs, but that you can also see that, you know, this could come undone, and then she, you know, you don't see her anymore. It's a delicate fight or a dance or some kind of choreography that she's engaged in. And you know, this tension, you know, that you maintain within the integrity of her form within this landscape, which is really mysterious. I think is, one of the many strengths of the work. So well
No,
done,
thank
Marigold.
you. Yeah, I just really enjoyed making those pieces because I felt like I was intuiting how it was going to happen. And, a lot of it is because it was already built up in my mind over time and over just exploring and uncovering what it was that I was fascinated with. And those are just iterations of it. It's going to evolve again and onwards, and I'll probably cross-reference that again in some other way. So they're all related to each other. But yeah, this idea of that being transparent, and I guess what you say about like the choreography of the dance between what is like strong and what is solid and tangible versus like what isn't and what is like imagined, that's sort of what I wanted also to really come through those figures, because they at the same time feel strong and solid while they look like they might actually fall apart. And then again, if it's like, if these woven parts of this figure maybe fall away, like what's left? Is it actually like an invisible person, or is that actually nothing? Like, so it's this really funny play. And there's always like a part of my work that I really want to have a little bit of humor, ambiguity, and awkwardness to them, and precariousness, while also like a little bit of like darkness and creepiness and mystery. So yeah, I really hope and that those really also come through in those pieces.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I could think, push the idea further, the question of invisibility, and I'm sort of thinking about the experience of being an Asian woman in North America, is kind of a really interesting thing to unpack as well in terms of the diasporic experience. I just kind of devoured Minor Feelings, right? That book by Kathy Park Hong, and so this question of invisibility is really present. It always has been for me, and it just kind of comes forth again. In this discussion, it's kind of really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe as a last question, I would love to just get a sense of these linked or woven departures that are not departures. They're all, rather, everything is fairly coherent in relation to your tattooing, your work, and ceramics. Yeah, so they seem to kind of evolve at the same time, or somehow, be linked.
Mm-hmm. It's true. They did kind of evolve around the same time. And I don't even think I noticed that until it was pointed out to me. And it was
Okay.
like, oh yeah, that's true. And again, I think it just was happening because I was like looking for new ways of expressing ideas that I had. And, at the time, I guess to address tattooing, I just have to like mention that when I was, 18, I got my first tattoo, and I was really excited about it. And it was something that I always wanted to do as a gift for myself. And it was something that, I really appreciated, and I always wanted to just be the person to get the tattoos. I didn't actually think I was ever going to give tattoos. And it's so interesting when I really think back to why I might have thought that. And maybe it was because in that time, it was just such a male dominated industry that it was even so hard for me to envision myself in that place. Furthermore, I didn't know much about it, and I was, I just was a little bit removed from that process. And then over time, I had people just say, hey, that's something that you should try, because they would see that I had tattoos, and then they were like, is that something you do? And I was like, no. And I always said that like, it wasn't something that I would be interested in, because I was like, and it's not something to say about my age, but I would just say that I'm just too old to do it. And it's not because I actually think I'm older, or that you can't do anything if you're old, but I was just maybe saying that because I thought, well, I really want to invest in my like studio practice, and I already have that, and to take on this thing would be a lot, and which is so interesting because it isn't. And again, it just speaks to experience and time that passes and like who you are as a person as you evolve. But over time, I decided that it was something that I wanted to try out, and I sought some information about it. And I found that the people who were willing to walk alongside with me on that journey were, you know, women, femme identifying, queer folk who were just really generous with their knowledge. And that was exactly what I was needing to hear, and confirmed that, you know, up until that point, the world and that tattoo world that I had understood was very male dominated and not as inviting as I thought it was going to be, and not willing to share that info. So I was, you know, wanted to then teach myself how to do it, you know, with the guidance of some people who are willing, and, you know, as a way of, you know, protest, as a political statement, and as a way for me to also acknowledge that in my heritage, in pre-colonial Philippines, tattooing was a massive form of culture. And it was just a way that, you know, there's different ways of understanding it in the communities that practice tattooing. But it was, you know, the point that I'm making is that it was a really present thing pre-contact, and then it was, you know, also demonized, and it was also you know, worked towards being eradicated. And now there's a resurgence to that. Now, I don't tattoo anything like traditional in that sense, but I acknowledge it so much. And I have, you know, peers that do, and that who I look up to very much. So so it was a way for me then to also take my knowledge and my learning into my own hands, and not be stopped by any gatekeeping, which I find is a really like oppressive way of learning, you know. And so I guess at the time too, at the same time as tattooing, I was also really interested in ceramics. And again, through shared knowledge, I met a ceramicist in Montreal. Her name is Marigold Santos, and she was so willing to just teach me ceramics. And I saw her work, and I was like, hey, you know, I'm curious about this ceramics. Like, do you like offer, you know, any kind of like mentorship or anything? And you know, what's amazing is we did it through trade. So I would tattoo her, and then she would teach me how to wheel throw, or how to build, you know. And it was this thing that was so beautiful. And I feel like I'm so grateful for those experiences, and grateful for the willingness for people to share that knowledge. And so I have a commitment to sharing knowledge too, because of that. And so, yeah, it was amazing. And then, you know, through even just talking to other people and their interpretations of ceramics, it's just another way for me to mark kind of a body as well. You know, the ceramic, the clay object becomes a surrogate for the body that's curved and organic and individual. And then I'm marking on it, and I'm touching it. And then through a series of like firing and, you know, processes, it becomes stronger and harder as it gets marked on its outside. And I feel like that's what tattooing is, you know, also. I feel like people collect tattoos for all the reasons, and all the reasons are valid. But I know that it's always very important to a person when they get their skin marked, and it means something to them. And for me personally, in my life and in the way I approach tattooing, is it's a way of self-care, and it's a way of self-adornment, because it's a way for me to accept my body, and you know, and to adorn it, and yeah, and to remember. It's a way of remembering.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, there's a mutual friend of ours who said that whatever medium you want to, you know, you want to work with, you master. You nail it. Like, you just, you know, your ability to, as an autodidact, is like, it knows no bounds. It's like, nothing would surprise me. Any new
My
medium.
next thing. Mm-hmm.
Oh, Marigold, thank you so much for your time and your generosity. And I hope we see each other in real life one day soon.
Yes, I thank you so much, Cheryl. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's really was amazing to speak with you about these things, and yeah, and I hope to see you in person, and
Yeah.
I hope to give you a tattoo one day.
Yes, yes. I'm in line for an aswang for a
Yeah,
strap.
yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much.